I began my Monday morning in a wonderful way, a contemplative, prayerful way, as I had signed up to do an online webinar with Oasis Ministries, which is the organization through which I did my spiritual director training, and they offer wonderful times of contemplation and meditation and engagement with the holy. And so this one was designed around contemplative peace. And so it was making these peace flags or these prayer flags. And so it was a time when they began telling us about the history of them, how there is symbolism in the colors, but it was originally taken from people in the Tibetan area, and many, many centuries ago had been used by warring communities. And people would carry these streamers or these flags into war that would accompany their war cries. But the Tibetan monks said, oh no, let's take what was used for violence and turn it into peace. And so they created them with the idea that you actually place them outside. And we allow the breeze that you will hear during this video to take these prayers, these offerings from my heart, and send them out into the world with the understanding, at least from our Christian point of view, that it is the Spirit that will take the prayers and have them land on exactly the right hearts, the ones that God needs to touch toward whatever healing in whatever way that may look like. So it was a wonderful experience, and I was delighted that the images and the words came to my heart, and I was able to visibly portray them. And as you will see as I show them to you more closely, I have St. Francis's prayer that said, let me be an instrument of your peace. Or we have this one with the dove, the sign of peace. And here I put, let us go forth in the world rejoicing in the power of the Spirit. Or, of course, the Beatles song, All You Need Is Love. And so I tried to gather parts within my heart that I could visibly express what I understood to be the truth of Christianity. So I'm thinking, I felt really right and really holy, and Christianity is about love and compassion and mercy and peace and reconciliation and all of these things, and I'm feeling really good. So when I finished this spiritual practice, I thought, well, let's get going on my homily preparation. So I opened the scriptures for this week, and I'm really quite surprised and really taken aback from this very holy experience connected to peace to the readings that have nothing to do with peace. And of course, we start with Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, and there's tension and there's conflict in the family. And I don't see them talking to each other or listening to each other's stories, and I don't hear any sense of reconciliation. I hear Sarah sending Hagar and Ishmael off into the desert to die. And worse than that, I hear God endorsing this plan. So I'm really kind of disturbed by this, and I'm thinking, well, what is going on here? Yeah, I get it that Sarah wanted Abraham's inheritance to go to Isaac, their child, but to send somebody out into the desert to die with just one skin of water? So that seemed really cruel and really disconcerting to me, and I thought, well, boy, is this foreshadowing the tension that would arise through different times in our world's history between the Islamic people and the Jewish people, because Sarah couldn't deal with the jealousy that she had or her fear, and she chose to cast someone away instead of trying to find that common place. But then I was reading the Hebrew, or looking at the Hebrew, not that I can still read the Hebrew, and when we look at the word that is used when Abraham cast Hagar out into the desert upon Sarah's desire, and it's actually the same word that is used when the Pharaoh sets free the Israelite people. So there's also a sense of liberation or emancipation in this. And so it also might say to us, well, God never wastes anything, and that maybe this was part of God's plan, that division and conflict can result in something that actually encompasses the plan of God. Maybe it was God's plan that from the beginning that God would raise up two separate nations that would have different voices and different language and ways to talk about God, but that God's voice would be spread further. So, I'm kind of dealing with that tension and feeling a bit uncomfortable about it. And then I read the passage from Paul, and then I get to the gospel, and I hear in Jesus's own words, as portrayed by the writer of Matthew's gospel, I came not to bring peace, but I came bringing a sword. And so I'm really wondering about that, and I'm thinking, boy, this is not fitting with my image of the Prince of Peace. So what's really going on here? So it's helpful when we look at both Matthew and Paul's writing to imagine the context. Who were they writing to? Because sometimes the words that they use or the message they offer is to specific people. Always it is to specific people. And so we want to know what was going on, and we can somewhat infer or move ourselves back into that space. So it seems as though Paul and Matthew are both saying, you know what, you need to walk the walk. So it sounded as though they were addressing communities that were willing to give assent to Jesus, to say, yes, I believe you're the Messiah, and yes, I love Jesus, and yes, I want to follow Jesus, and yet they weren't. They were holding on to the old ways of their lives. They were bringing along that old baggage. They weren't willing to let go of relationships that weren't life-giving. They weren't willing to look at their systems that they were a part of. Now, this comes true, of course, in the Jewish people with the temple system, and there's a lot of criticism there because it was a system that said you're in or you're out. And those who are out are never going to come in. They had a very strong purity code. And this, of course, comes up in Luke's gospel around the story of the Good Samaritan. The Levite walks right by the man in need because he was impure. And of course, that community was also connected to the Roman oppression. And so they were connected to a political system that did not honor the following of Jesus and the way of love, that also said, here's a group of elite, and you're either elite or you're not. So there was a lot of that going on, a lot of thinking, because in this passage, Jesus is really saying to us, I want all of you. Are you willing to say and live and think and feel as though I have your heart more than anything else in this world? It's not unlike those of us who come to church on Sunday morning and we start our Monday as though we never had come to church. That we can assent to Jesus, that we can say we're doing the right thing, and we can believe in Jesus. But are we leaving church being changed? Are we willing to be able to look at the way we live our lives, or the decisions that we make, or who we honor? Are we really willing and able to say, I love Jesus more than anything, and I'm willing to lay my life down? And that means, am I willing to lay down my old life so a new life can emerge? Am I willing to actually reform or relinquish relationships that do not support my fullness in Christ? Am I really willing to make decisions based on my belief that I am called to respect the dignity of all people, or that I'm to strive for justice and peace in all the world? These are really hard questions. I know they are. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we all must say at some point or other we fall a bit short, maybe a lot of the time. But we understand there is something driven in us now because of our baptism that will draw us into the right place. But when I look at these hard questions and I ponder them with honesty, this does not bring about in me any sense of peace. This brings about in me an acknowledgement that I'm going to have some sleepless nights, and I'm going to have some gut-wrenching reality just show up in my heart, and I'm not always going to know what to do with that. And so some of us choose not to even look at it, to just go along and say, yeah, I love Jesus, and live my life the way I had before. And others of us are going to find and be aware of the division between how I want to be and who I really am. And it's a really hard place. And it's easy to run from that. But I'm going to invite you to stay in there and go into the hard questions, because peace follows that. Because Jesus wasn't saying so much pick up your sword and create division. But Jesus was saying, if you follow me, if you love me with all your heart and soul and might, conflict will follow. There are going to be people who will not understand. There are going to be occasions when I'm going to make a decision and people will criticize me. There are going to be times that people will just plain want to be away from me because of some of the things I might say out of my love of Jesus. So, this is really a hard place to be, and we can find ourselves in this place often. But the reality is that Jesus says, yes, conflict is going to follow, but there is something beyond that. There is a peace that you can find, and we can do that because what Jesus always talks about is this spiritual bond that is actually existent among the believers of Christ, and I believe within the whole human family, as Bishop Curry often talks about, and that there is this spiritual bond that goes deeper than any division that we can create. So it means that we may not think alike, and we may not look alike, and we may have very different stances on what we think things should, how we think things should work out. But if we all acknowledge the human dignity of all people, if we go back to the core of what Jesus was about, with the greatest commandment, love God and love your neighbor, how we get there may be different. But if we can hold on to that idea, then we will find a place of peace. It does mean that it requires some hard work. And it does mean that I need to know who you are if you are different than I am. I think it's a very deeper place that Jesus is inviting us into today. I think it is a deeper place than let's agree to disagree. Or you let me be you, I'll let you be you, and you need to let me be me. Because in each of those we're claiming division, and that's always the first step. We're claiming a chasm that is between us and someone else, but we don't want to dig our heels in and stay there, because that's not the way of peace. The way of peace is to allow that deeper bond to emerge, for us to be able to be kind to one another, to be careful with one another, to be attentive to the words that we use when we are speaking to one another. And we can be open to living into our baptismal covenant, when we can allow our hearts to actually embrace it, rather than be something we recite every once in a while in church. There is a path through this, and it is actually a really hard invitation that I'm asking, that I'm laying forth for you, to stay with the questions. Acknowledge the chasm, whether that's between who you are and who you want to be, or between you and a family member, or between someone in our parish family, or someone in the human family, to acknowledge the division. That's a good place to get. But then to know that that's not the end. The end is to find a place of peace, and that's where we're working toward. And so I invite you, just as I did with these prayer flags, and maybe you'll make these with me someday, or maybe you'll find another very visible expression of claiming your truth as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, that you are willing and able to work to that deeper place where we can find peace among all people and draw all of us together in a sense of living out what we believe to be the truth of Jesus, that Jesus was indeed the Prince of Peace. And if we do that hard work, and if we do it together, we will then experience the peace that passes all understanding. I know I can't wait until we're back in church, and I can just say to you, the peace of the Lord be always with you. And every time I say that, I just have this most wonderful feeling of your hearts filling up with joy and centeredness and hopefulness and all the things that I think come with being Christian. But I also say that to you, knowing that it is also a challenge, because we can't be at peace by ourselves if others are not. So let's do this work together. Let's find a way through the flags or through your prayers or through whatever other ways you can do this to state your truth, which is Jesus' truth, that there is a spiritual bond that we can acknowledge and we can celebrate and we can live into, now and forever. Amen.